I won't motivate this. I think everybody here knows the general societal issue we're talking about. But I will narrowly say what the objective of this study I'm going to talk about was today is if you turn back the clock about 18 months, nobody had done an economic assessment of what is the aggregate meat demand impact of increasing media attention to this issue of animal welfare. Okay? There's been lots of different studies. For instance, I've done work on what drives voting behavior on things like Prop 2 in California, a host of things like that. But nobody had backed up and did an aggregate meat demand assessment, right? I.e., does the typical consumer, kind of an aggregate for the U.S. population, quote unquote, change their purchasing behavior, right? As we talk more about this issue. To give you some examples of basically why this is germane, the issue of how other societal issues influence the meat industry are commonly influenced in similar manners. Food safety is something we've talked about, I'd argue, for longer than animal welfare, and several folks like myself, and including myself, have estimated meat demand models basically say what's the increasing attention to food safety on beef demand. What's that impact? What's that impact on pork demand? What's that impact on poultry demand? And so forth. I'm going to use similar methods that are behind this particular work. Okay. The reason I'm doing that is so folks like myself that work in this arena are increasingly, if you like, concerned. Not that I'm out to save one entity or another, but I'm concerned that things might be moving in a direction that doesn't match what the average meat purchaser wants. Now, that doesn't mean that's necessarily wrong, but if there's a mismatch there, economists see economic loss coming down the pike. Okay? So I'm not going to say this is good or bad for individual entity or anything in this discussion, but if that is true, I want to know that there's economic loss coming from these adjustments, i.e. bans of certain practices in different states and so forth. So these kind of general demand, real demand changes, if they exist or not, if they exist, how large are they, are pretty important to quantify. To give credit where it's due, Dr. Nicole Olink, who is at Purdue University, formerly was a graduate student at Michigan State University, which to be fair is actually where I was at when I started this particular project. I joined Kansas State about a year ago. She's my collaborator, my co-author on this particular study I'm going to talk about. Okay, so what did we do? We did a massive search using a proprietary database that you have at universities called LexisNexis that basically searches over major newspaper and magazine outlets across the U.S. for articles that contain certain keywords. As I tried to say earlier, this has been done on issues like food safety, the impact of the Atkins diet on beef demand. Similar processes have been, parallel implementations of this process have been done. So the first part that's worthwhile to be transparent on, I try to be transparent, and on this kind of controversial issue, it's more important to be transparent, is the keywords you choose can matter, right? I'm trying to populate what I call a media index that basically is proxying how much information the average consumer is getting about animal welfare issues, okay? And I don't claim to be an animal welfare expert from a handling standpoint, or I don't work in the animal science department, those kind of things. So working with somebody that does is very important. And because I'm not above dropping names, I worked closely with Janice Swanson when I was back in Michigan State, and I relied on her expertise and some of her colleagues to make sure we had a decent set of keywords. Okay, and where we ended up was, and you guys can read, this is the host of keywords we included. Right? And basically what we're doing is doing a search over time going back to 1980 to see how many articles these keywords would find. Okay? And I'll show you the graph in a minute. It's no surprise. There's an increasing number of articles that are being flagged, if you like, in the U.S. media that catch portions of these different keywords. Okay? The other thing that's worth knowing, and I don't have it explicit on the slide, is we went further than just this search. Basically, you can do this search, and then you can break it down and do it specific by species. So it's one thing to do this in a broad sense, and then you can go deeper and you can put basically a constraint saying and beef or cattle, and develop, we call that our beef cattle index. Same thing on pork side, same thing on poultry side. Okay? Here's a chart of what these indices are. Again, this is back to 1980 if you can't read the scale. This was done through 2000. I think we did the search through the end of 2009. I'm not going to belabor these, but the general point is, over time, the general public is getting more information on this issue. I think everybody here would agree with that, right? Whether or not I created the indices correctly, we could probably debate, but the general trend makes sense. And there's some big events that show up in this that are pretty obvious. I just highlight one. Just to make a side point, the Westland Hallmark event that occurred in early 2008 resulted in a spike in this index. Right? There's lots of media attention. You remember that was the largest beef recall ever. Some parts of the media considered that a food safety event. Some considered that an animal welfare event. I would argue it was both. The average consumer walked away with both those in their head. Okay, that's an example of an intertwined issue that I get keep in mind when talking about animal welfare. But this type of approach, assessing what's in the media, is going to catch those kind of events. Is the general point. Okay. All right. The reason we're doing that search is I'm trying to come up with something quantifiable, some numeric measure of information the public's getting about animal welfare. Okay, so that's the reason we created an index. What I really want to do with it is figure out if meat demand, beef demand, pork demand, poultry demand has changed in result of those increases that have been at different rates at different points in time for different species. Okay, so we're going to estimate what I'm going to call an aggregate demand model. I didn't bring equations, so those of you that have seen, economists give presentations, you should be happy. I'm not going to do that to you. I don't think this is the right place for that kind of stuff. I can answer those questions if you want, but I didn't do that. What we did was we estimated a beef, pork, poultry, or what I call non-meat food demand system. And this is an important point, because when you estimate these kind of systems, you have to choose what products you're going to look at. And most people would have initially said, okay, we're going to look at beef, pork, and poultry, and stop there. One problem with that kind of an approach, without belaboring this as an academic point, is if I did that, I would not allow for, let's call it, out-of-meat substitutions. Okay? Whatever occurred out of beef would have to be a net gain in pork or poultry, and vice versa, mathematically, those models work. Well, that doesn't fit what I do know is going on, right, or I observe casually, so it's very important to include the possibility for exiting the meat complex. Okay? And as you'll see later on, that's a big part of the story. Okay? So that's what I mean when I say I allow for cross-meat, i.e. substitute beef for pork or pork for poultry, as well as total out-of-meat substitution effects. I think it's very important here. And we control for other things that I'm not going to talk about today, but just to let you know, these aren't what's behind my results. Time trend effects, quarterly seasonality, changes in own prices, total meat expenditures, and then finally, what's the impact of those increasing media indices that I'm talking about on meat demand. That's the part I'm going to talk about today. Okay. Here's a summary without a single number on its slide. So again, I went out of my way to not only give you equations, but I have numbers in a minute. I'm trying to keep it straightforward. We tested lots of hypotheses with this particular demand system. Okay, and we reject a few notions. You guys can read these. The first thing is we reject the hypothesis of no animal welfare media effects. Right? In other words, I can run this model as is. I can run it forcing no impacts. I strongly reject that in favor of allowing animal welfare effects to occur. That was expected. That's the first thing to test. Okay? Moreover, you can go deeper and test how long these effects last. So after a particular article hits the media, how long is there a observed meat demand impact? Okay? Well, we reject that it's what I call contemporaneously only. So I reject the notion that an impact only occurs within a quarter. This is a quarterly model, right? I.e., there's a life beyond the first 3 months of an event. Okay? However, I also reject the notion of it going beyond 6 months. So if you follow me, what this amounts to is animal welfare effects are significant, and in aggregate, they persist for 3 to 6 months. And it's a quarterly model, so they persist into the second quarter. Okay? What we fail to reject is a very important point, I think, is that these cross-species spillover effects are zero. I'm going to give you an example if you're not following me. A cross-species spillover possibility would be that, let's pick on that Hallmark event for a second here, that's largely attributed with the beef industry, plus the media would put that particular spike in the industry. What could have occurred was for the pork and poultry industry to quote-unquote gain from that. That'd be a cross-species spillover effect, right? And actually that's been found on equivalent food safety applications before. What we fail to reject is all those kind of cross-species substitutions, all the different ways, pork indices on beef demand and so forth, are jointly zero. I fail to reject that statement. Okay? And that's why I highlighted this in red. It's the only thing I haven't read on my slides, I believe. The important part of that is animal welfare impacts in general lead to an expenditure reallocation to non-meat, you can see this numerically in a minute, as opposed to changes across meats. Right? The reason that's important is one of my drum-beating points is I'm convinced that no species is quote-unquote immune, even though different species have had different experiences, different duration of discussions on the animal welfare front and so forth, because there's no species that's directly gaining, for this study, from quote-unquote negative events on another age. Yes, please. Did I term it positive? Did it find anything that's quote-unquote the industry's doing a good thing on the welfare front? The honest answer is it did, and it found lots of negatives, and I can't tell you the balance. And you'll see on my very last slide, what this process does, the keywords I showed you are explicitly keywords I used, and the only additional piece of it I did was add the species constraint, so A and B for cattle, whatever, to give me a beef cattle index. I did not go in and sort and call that a positive article, a negative article, a neutral article, nor did I go in and say it's from, livestock entity X versus concern EGO X versus university X, okay? The reason that's important is I did it for a reason. I'm capturing the net tone, net positive, negative, right? The net that everything's getting out there. In my first shot assessment, that's what you're seeing today. It's very, very, very subjective to go in and say that's a positive article, that's a negative. And lots of researchers ahead of me have basically said that's a really slippery slope, be careful what you do. And I have a lot more confidence giving you a net result first, and basically flagging that if you read my paper, which 2 people in the world probably have done, just another academic article, there's a whole paragraph in there explicitly about this is net effects. In the future, if somebody can figure out a less subjective way to score positive versus negative, that's an important piece. And I have that as on my final slide. I think it's an important future work piece. But quite honestly, I'm not comfortable doing that, nor am I comfortable giving, guidance to a student to do it for me or whatever. It's a very subjective thing. Fair enough? To continue with the summary here, I also think it's important. I know we're having a animal welfare oriented talk here today, but the economic effects that we find in this model from animal welfare information are notably smaller than price and meat expenditure effects. And this is expected, okay? And stated differently, doubling of my animal welfare media indices has a lot smaller impact on demand than doubling of price or doubling of consumer income expenditure. And frankly, I expected that. I consider that a good thing in the model, because that's what we find when we do similar food safety applications, or I use the Atkins guide example. I've applied it different ways, so that it's kind of a robustness point here. So price still matters, is the other part that's relevant. You can't change, get away from these issues at the cost of the price of the product, because that's a bigger issue. Okay. Increases in the media attention, right, as these indices are going up, have done, if you want a summary for 3 different industries here, not directly impacted beef demand. So in other words, as the index over time, go back to 1980, for the beef industry went up, that's not had a statistically significant impact on beef. Okay. Now, I want to emphasize direct impact. I'll come back to the indirect impacts of stuff. However, there is a direct impact on pork demand and a direct impact on poultry demand, both of which are detrimental, i.e. more information in the media about this reduces pork and poultry demand exclusively. I see several of you writing down numbers. You're welcome to do that, but I'll tell you ahead of time, the next to the last slide has 2 or 3 hyperlinks. It's probably more useful for you to write down so you can see the actual numbers. If you write as messy as I do, you may not even know what your own numbers are anymore. The last point here, just to give you a take-home conclusion, if you like, it's quantifiable. Between 1999 and 2008, first quarter and fourth quarter, the pork and poultry indices that we developed and used in this model increased by 181%, 253%. Okay, so they more than just. Those are associated with, per our estimates, a reduction of 2.65% or 5% in pork and poultry demand respectively. Stated differently, had those indices not increased, if you had the same amount of media attention in the fourth quarter of 2008 as you had in 1999, the pork demand you observed would be 2.65% higher. The poultry demand you observed would have been 5.01% higher. Okay? Now, price effects are larger than that. Consumer income effects are larger than that. But for an industry, I think those 2 numbers are worth noting. Right? We normally don't have 10-20% swings in pork demand. Right? That's a kind of an odd thing. So anytime we observe 2 or 3% changes over time, they're worth noting for aggregate industry discussions. So what are some implications of this? First, aggregate meat demand impacts do exist. Remember my very first statement. I rejected the notion that they were significant. Okay? That definitely begs the question, okay, so if there's demand impacts, that to me says at least a portion of the public would value some adjustment. Now we can debate what that adjustment is, but they would value some kind of adjustment, right, that would lead to a reduction in quote-unquote negative part of the media attention that's coming up, okay? But, A, what are they? And B, as an economist, do the cost of those adjustments right? How do they match up to the benefits implied by avoiding this negative demand response? Okay. The problem is there's not a lot of work that's been done on exactly what is the adjustment they want. It's one thing to tell the industry you're going to ban practice, another thing to say what the replacement will be. Hopefully everybody follows me on that. I'll pick on gestation television for a second. Right, those bans are going in place, but there's far from universal agreement on what the replacement should be. Right, that dilemma is important here because I don't know what the average Joe in this model considers is sufficient. Much less is there a lot of work done that says what those adjustment costs would be that I could turn around and compare with my work. Okay. That being said, that's something that needs to be done going forward. Okay, so put that out there. It also, I think, in the spirit of thought-provoking points, highlights what I think is a big dilemma here, a little bit of a disconnect between resident voting behavior and meat consumption behavior. Okay? A lot, at least here within the U.S., a lot of the discussions we're having as it relates to production practice adjustments, right, or bans in different states and so forth, are being triggered by either explicitly ballot voting or resident pressure for state legislation. Okay? They're not occurring in the spirit of the free market working where we're rapidly increasing change of product that's being offered on the meat counter shelf. Right? I'm very much a free market economist as a disclosure here, but if I truly thought the average Joe was willing to pay what it took to, right, have a different production scheme in place, I think the meat industry in a generic sense would figure that out, provided have a meat product that has that label on it. We don't observe the latter, we observe the voting behavior, that's a disconnect. Okay? I'm not saying somebody's doing something right or wrong here, but this disconnect has economic consequences is the point. Right? Going forward, we can quantify that in different ways, but that's part of the motivation for the study, and it's just highlighted here if you recognize the drivers of change versus the significant, but let's call them probably not enough to cover adjustment cost conclusions that I get from the aggregate meat study. Okay? Budget reallocation effects. What I mean by that is, if the main effect is a switch from, let's say, pork expenditures to non-meat food, as opposed to from pork to beef or from pork to poultry, or different examples I can give you, right? This very much in my head supports a broader meat response, because it's not clear to me how one species is gaining, right, from another species struggling, because they're not gaining, right, the demand side of the story, right? If I would have found significant positive cross-species factors, I'd have even more controversial point to bring to you, right? If I would have found the beef industry is gaining from negative attention to the poultry industry, for instance, I would show that to you. I'd definitely bring it to you, but it would be a little harder discussion. The fact that it doesn't exist in our findings tells me that all three need to play together in the sandbox in a sense. Okay. All right. Now, this is where the lady in the back asked me about the positive and negative. This is where we'll be very transparent. Future work needs to be done to see how long my comments are accurate for. Reassessment replication is needed. Every researcher should give you that disclaimer. This is the only study I know of that has attempted to quantify aggregate demand impacts on animal welfare. That should be a red flag. Don't take any one study to granted, right? You should want it done more in the future, at least replicated over time, see if it's still robust and so forth. We did everything, quote unquote, the right way per the economics discipline, it's peer-reviewed journal placement, blah, 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 but you should see studies replicated more going forward, and I hope generally to support that. Also, we have net information, right? The net of positive and negative is in this study, as opposed to trying to sort out positive versus negative, right? You may well have, behind the scenes on my beef industry, I said there's no direct impacts. I can't tell you, but it's quite possible that beef demand is very much pulled in a positive way in response to quote-unquote positive articles, very much pulled in a negative way in response to negative articles, and what I'm observing is a net zero. Now, part of me says there's a little bit of that to that story, but per my approach, and I'm trying to be transparent with you, we're getting the net information, right? So I end up at that 0 point. But if reality is there's a strong tug and pull, and consumers really responding both ways, the industry needs to know that. Okay? We haven't assessed it. You heard my warning about it. It's very tricky. You got to be very careful how you score those articles, because I think it could put you down in the paths. But nonetheless, I think it has to be thought about. Okay? Likewise, there's no delineation by the source. And hopefully you followed in my response to the lady in the back. We can do this by articles sourced by, quote unquote, the industry versus NGOs versus the government. I mean, you can do this in that sense also. The benefit of that would be a little bit less subjective. I mean, even the concept of NGOs we can debate, but that's less less subjective than positive versus negative. So that might be a step in that direction to break down the total media information. You might have a deeper understanding of what's going on if you do that, but we haven't done it yet. In the spirit of being the first one to do this, I wanted to do the least of that subjective work as possible the first round. Okay? And then lastly, I'll end, and I'll use the pork example just to motivate this point. I often think we kind of bury our heads in the sand on some of these kind of discussions and lose sight of the bigger issues that's going on. And I regularly give discussions about, what's going on in a broader sense in the meat industry, right? And everybody in this room knows how strong exports are at the moment, right? And everybody's talking about that, what that's doing to domestic prices and so forth. Well, recognizing that, bringing that to today's discussion, one has to think about issues like, where's the U.S. in a global comparative advantage sense, right? If it wants to maintain its current exports and or expand them, if you're going to further change, right, the production scheme in place here. Stated more bluntly, if the global consumer doesn't care about using gestation stalls or something else, this could be at the cost of exports going forward, right? And there's other examples. I don't even pick on the pork industry. That's just an easy one to throw out there to relate to. But all the buzz on export growth needs to be remembered in these kind of discussions as well. So I'm sure I ruffled some feathers there. Before I take any more questions, for those of you that haven't been there, I'll put a plug in for agmanager.info is the website that all the economists at Department of Ag Econ at Kansas State put information out on, myself included. There's a livestock and meat marketing page more narrowly into there. There's a lot of stuff. The second link there is just a subset of that. I'll simply note there's a producer-friendly 4-page fact sheet that goes with the actual journal article. I made a joke about 2 people reading my journal article. The fact sheets get read a lot. That's very common. They're both there and available for you. I'm a young guy that's trying to do something new. I also have some YouTube videos where I went out and done an 8 or 9 minute kind of summary of this study. If you want to see that, make sure I'm consistent with what I told you today. You're more than welcome. But hopefully I'm getting this message out to a different set of listeners than I typically do when I'm invited to come speak to Producer X Group. So I'll put that plug in, not just run on my head count, but for those of you that want to read details, you're welcome to do it down with this stuff.